Alright, so if you're watching this video, it's more than likely that you've seen the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. If you're like me and the majority of the Formula 1 fan base, then chances are you loved it and found it very entertaining. So in this video, I'm going to go over the reasons this race was so good. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So the first thing that I personally think made the Azerbaijan Grand Prix stand out this year was the drivers' positions in the practice sessions and qualifying. Mercedes were doing quite poorly even though they've got one of the top cars on the grid. This definitely shook things up a little bit and gave the other teams the opportunities to show their strengths throughout the weekend. Most notably Ferrari, with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz absolutely gelling with the car and setting lap times that weren't exactly expected, which created a ton of hype and excitement for the race to come. Another key factor in the practice sessions was the dreaded turn 15. Well, dreaded for the drivers but kept us at home on our toes. See, the thing is, I don't necessarily want to see the drivers crash in practice and qualifying all too much, but here it was a very different story. Here we saw how some of the greatest drivers in the world handled one very tricky corner. We saw the inconsistencies the drivers had throughout the weekend with this one turn, and every time a driver got near it, there was no guarantee that they could bring that car out of there in one piece. Now, I don't know about you, but that definitely added a strong element of excitement for the race to come. How would they handle the turn with all the extra fuel in the tank and the drivers around them? You had to wait for the race to find out, and the fans just couldn't wait. In qualifying, we had a ton going on. The amount of red flags was interesting to say the very least. And at the end of it all, we had 4 different teams in the top 4 places. Talk about mixing the grid up. We had an unexpected crash from Daniel Ricciardo in Q2 which cut his qualifying short and landed him a P13 starting position. Then, on pole position, we had Charles Leclerc in his Ferrari. Even he said that he was surprised with his pole lap. He seemed confident in his lap times overall, but said that on his pole lap specifically, he made a couple of mistakes and was surprised as to how competitive his lap time was. Both Carlos Sainz and Yuki Tsunoda both crashed and ended the qualifying session early, leaving the likes of Max Verstappen very frustrated that he couldn't complete his final attempts at beating Leclerc's insanely competitive lap time. Overall, after qualifying, I personally left clueless with what could happen in the race the next day. There was so much uncertainty, you couldn't help but feel excited, and oh boy were we in for a fun ride. In my opinion, the first half of the race was fairly calm up until lap 31 where Lance Stroll got a puncture on the main straight and crashed. This is where things started getting hot. Now again, a race doesn't need devastating crashes like this to be fun to watch. Compromising the safety of the drivers for our entertainment would be anything but intelligent. But with that said, Lance's crash definitely gave us an insight to how the updated Pirelli tyres really handled under pressure. And looking back was also like a foreshadowing to what was going to happen later on in the race. Once the track was clear and the safety car was back in the pits, things only got spicier. Verstappen kept his lead with Perez on his tail, followed by Hamilton, but behind that we had Sebastian Vettel, who decided he wanted the smoke. He wasn't having it in P6 and said nope. He wanted a podium. The world champion Seb was back, and alongside him we had Pierre Gasly and Charles Leclerc, who were also determined to get a higher position. Now if this wasn't a good race so far, we saw the race leader Max Verstappen hit the barriers on the main straight due to a puncture on the rear left tire, just like Lance Stroll's. Now Pirelli had some explaining to do. Things were looking unacceptable on their end, but their response would have to wait because the race was soon red flagged on lap 49 and all the cars would be sent back to the pits, uncertain as to if the race would restart. Nevertheless, pit crew started changing the tires to the soft compound because if there was going to be a restart, then the drivers would want the best chance at snatching whatever positions they could in 2 laps. So when it was announced that the race would indeed have a restart, uncertainty hit once again. But why care? I mean, there are only 2 laps left. Not much can happen in 2 laps, right? Right? Well, let me just say, once the 10-minute timer was up, if you weren't still watching for whatever reason, congratulations, you missed the main event. You might as well have skipped all 49 previous laps, but these 2, oh no, these 2 were a race in itself. And if you really want to know the answer to the title of this video, it all comes down to these final 2 laps. Once the lights were out, all eyes were glued to the screen. There was no time to look away. From the first turn, Lewis Hamilton locked up and essentially threw his race into the bin. But what was interesting is that now the championship lead battle remains the same, with no changes to the points whatsoever. This left Perez in the lead, and behind him was a ruthless battle for second place between Gasly and Vettel. And I'll tell you what, the back and forth between those 2 was absolutely mind-boggling. And don't forget that these 2 laps were the deciding factor for this whole race, so the adrenaline was indeed pumping. After the 2 quick and steamy laps, we got a super satisfying podium, with Checo in P1, Seb in P2, and Pierre in P3, all of which were well deserved. After that we had Leclerc and Norris, who also drove a serious deal in the final 2 laps to round off the top 5 drivers. Overall, to once again reiterate why the Azerbaijan Grand Prix was so good was mainly down to the sheer amount of uncertainty all weekend. Now, I know races cannot produce the same sort of results every time, but that's the beauty of racing. And the way it all came together in Baku was just outstanding, and I'm confident in saying that this will compete as one of, if not the best race of this season. Yeah, so that's the video. If you liked it, consider subscribing and leaving a like. I'll be sure to post more videos like this in future, and that's the point of this channel. But yeah, on that note, I hope you all have a good night, and I hope to see you next time.